study of introductory economics is typically divided into microeconomics and macroeconomics, and this lecture inaugurates the macroeconomics section of this course. What is macroeconomics? Well, we talked about it way back in lecture 1, but maybe it's worth repeating. Macroeconomics is the aggregated top-down view of the economy, focused on issues like unemployment, inflation, economic growth, and the balance of trade. It may help to think of it in contrast to the microeconomic view presented earlier. Instead of thinking about how individuals react and the incentives for firms and competition, we're instead going to think about the whole economy as one large organism. A macroeconomic perspective is not just a scaled-up version of microeconomics. Remember, microeconomics discusses what happens in individual markets, but microeconomics has no real language for talking about overall problems of the economy, like growth and inflation and unemployment and trade deficits. For example, microeconomics can say, why does the equilibrium quantity grow for a certain good or service in terms of shifts in demand and supply? But it can't say, why does equilibrium quantity grow for the entire economy? Microeconomics can say why the price rises or falls for a certain good, but it doesn't explain why all prices might rise together in a process of inflation. Microeconomics can explain why the export of a certain good or the import of a certain good rises or falls, but not why an overall imbalance in trade exists. And moreover, microeconomics has no structure for really talking about macroeconomic policies. What about the federal budget and budget deficits? What about the Federal Reserve and how it manipulates interest rates in the U.S. economy? What about national boundaries and issues involving international trade? All of those are topics we need to talk about as we work through macroeconomics. In fact, behavior which is rational for individuals at the microeconomic level can sometimes lead to unexpected conclusions when everyone in a group acts that way. So you have to be really careful before taking the logic of individual behavior in microeconomics and using it to try and explain outcomes at the macroeconomic level. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. First, a sort of non-economic example. Imagine you're in a stadium and you're watching a concert or something where you're in a big crowd. You feel like you can't see well. So one person stands up for a better view. Then others stand up. And eventually everyone is standing up. Now, everyone acted rationally from a microeconomic and individual point of view. That is, everyone stood up to see better. But the end macroeconomic result was no one saw any better than they had before if they'd all been sitting down. So there's a possibility that the microeconomic behavior that made sense combines to produce an unexpected and undesired macroeconomic outcome. Or imagine that you're a farmer and you want to make more money, so you decide to plant a lot more crops. That's a sensible microeconomic approach. But what if all farmers want to make more money and they all plant more crops? Supply of that crop expands dramatically. The price declines as a result, and so that even when all the farmers are selling more output, everyone ends up making less money than they did before. Again, this raises a possibility that microeconomic behavior could combine to produce unexpected and undesired macroeconomic results. So, what's our starting point for thinking about macroeconomics? Let's start with the basic idea of gross domestic product, which is the standard measure for the size of a nation's macroeconomy. Specifically, gross domestic product is defined as the total value of final goods and services produced in an economy in a year, usually. And lots of other macroeconomic issues and terms start off from this idea of gross domestic product, or GDP as it's often called, as a basic concept. I should mention in passing that there's some other ways of measuring the size of an economy too, like gross national product, GNP, or net national product, NNP. And for practical purposes, it actually doesn't matter a heck of a lot which one you choose, as long as you don't jump back and forth between different definitions. But GDP is the standard, and it's the one I'll stick to. GDP can be measured in different ways. It can be measured either according to the value of what is produced or according to the value of what is demanded and bought. Since the quantity supplied in the whole economy must equal the quantity demanded in the whole economy, these measures have to be equal to each other. So, one way to measure GDP is to count up what's produced in the economy. And at a broad level, this is typically divided into the production of durable goods, the production of non-durable goods, the production of services, and the production of structures. Now, the specific numbers here are going to change year to year, and personally, I always sort of need to look up the specific data. But let me give you numbers for an illustrative year. For 2004, the total GDP of the United States was $11.7 trillion. Divided up into the categories I just mentioned, 14.5% of that was durable goods, stuff like refrigerators and cars. 17.9% of it was non-durable goods, stuff like food and clothing. 57.3% of it was services, and 10.3% of it was structures. Now, what's interesting about this pattern is that many people, when they think about the economy, the first thing that leaps to mind is durable goods, stuff like cars and refrigerators, hard stuff that comes out of factories. But the non-durable goods, like food and clothing, are actually a bigger share of the economy than durable goods. And services, stuff like healthcare, education, financial, legal, haircuts, car repair, lawn or home cleaning services, child care, all those services are well over half of all U.S. output. You hear people say sometimes that, we live in a service economy, and this is literally true. The share of services in the U.S. economy has been expanding over decades. At well over half of GDP is now services, and it's probably heading to higher still in the future. You can also measure GDP from the demand side. So instead of measuring what's produced, you measure what is demanded for different purposes. What's demanded by consumers, what's demanded by business for investment, what's demanded by government, what's demanded for purposes of international trade. Let me give you the breakdown in those dimensions. Of course, it still has to be the same size of GDP. So GDP in 2004 was $11.7 trillion, just the same as if you measured it in terms of what was actually produced. But if you break that down into the categories, they're going to be first consumption. And consumption is the biggest demand category of GDP. It accounts for about 70% of the total. Investment spending by business is much smaller. Investment spending is about 16% of GDP. But it tends to be much more volatile. Consumption spending, it tends to be about 70% of GDP year in, year out. But when firms think it's a good time to invest or a not good time to invest, they tend to move in bunches. They all invest together or they all decide not to invest. And so, even though investment spending is smaller, it tends to lead the fluctuations of the economy. Government spending, government demand for goods and services, is about 19% of GDP. That may seem a little bit low if you recognize that federal, state, and local governments together collect about 1/3 of GDP in taxes in the United States. But remember here, we're just talking about government actually buying stuff directly, government demand for final goods and services. So all the government programs that take money and pass it along to citizens, like Social Security or welfare programs, show up as part of consumption. They don't show up in government spending. Then the final categories of spending are exports and imports. Exports are demand from other countries for what is produced in the United States. So that's a demand for something produced in the United States. So we add that to total demand for the U.S. goods and services, but we need to subtract off imports. After all, imports are U.S. demand going to products made abroad. And in recent years, imports have been a lot bigger than exports. That means the U.S. has a trade deficit, a subject we'll take up in depth a few lectures further down the road. So, quick shorthand here. If you ask an economist what's GDP, sometimes they'll say it's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And that's a working definition of gross domestic product. Who actually measures this stuff? Who measures all these goods and services and what's produced and what's demanded? All across the U.S. economy that takes 14 digits to measure it in dollars. In the U.S., the statistical agency is a branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce called the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The BEA collects data from all sorts of surveys and sources. Some of them are monthly, some of them are quarterly, some of them are annual, and often the government statisticians need to extrapolate and make sure everything comes together somehow. What they do each quarter is an advance estimate right after the quarter has ended of what they think GDP is during that quarter, and then what's called a preliminary estimate, and then a final estimate. And if you look in the newspapers, you'll see sometimes that there could be large changes from the final estimate back to the preliminary estimate. Also, every 5 years, the BEA goes back and reviews all the numbers and changes that it's made over that time, and sometimes changes them quite substantially. So in some cases, our view of the economy and how it proceeded is altered quite a lot 5 years after the fact. There's an old joke that there are two things that are hard to swallow after you've watched them being made: sausages and economic estimates. But still, I think the folks at the BEA do a creditable professional job. And perhaps most important of all, there's a certain discipline of time. If they make a mistake, they tend to figure it out as time goes on, and then over time it gets adjusted. I should also mention that BEA has a really nice website. It answers lots of basic questions about GDP. It gives up-to-date data and historical data broken down in lots of different ways. So you want to learn more, that's a good place to start. So we've got GDP. What do we look at next? Usually the next adjustment to make is per capita GDP. That refers to dividing GDP by the population. Per capita GDP is a nice, simple, rough way of comparing the standard of living in different places and times. So if we divide the U.S. economy in 2004, with the GDP in 2004 of 11.7 trillion, and we divide that by the population of 294 million, that will equal approximately $40,000 per person. So U.S. per capita GDP in 2004 was about $40,000 a person. Now, per capita GDP is especially useful in comparing situations where population is really, really different. That could be two countries or the same time period in one country, or two different time periods in one country. For example, the U.S. in 1900 had a population of 76 million, which is about 1/4 of the population early in the 21st century. So if you're comparing economic output a century ago and now, you really need to adjust for population and look at per capita GDP. Per capita GDP can also be really useful in comparing countries with large population to countries with less population. Let me give you an extreme example. China's economy has a GDP of about $1.3 trillion early in the 21st century. Belgium, on the other hand, has a GDP of about $250 billion, which is about 1/5 as large. Now, China also has a population of about 1.3 billion, while Belgium has a population of 10 million. Belgium has less than 1% as many people as China does. So if you look at this on a per capita basis, according to per capita GDP, China is a 1.3 trillion economy divided by 1.3 billion people. So the per capita GDP is about $1,000. Belgium has a GDP of 250 billion divided by a population of 10 million for a per capita GDP of about $25,000. So by size of GDP, China is 5 times larger. By per capita GDP, Belgium is 25 times larger than China. Next important adjustment to make is to think about real GDP. To economists, the word real just means adjusted for inflation. You may remember this usage of the term when we were talking about real interest rates. The nominal interest rate was the interest rate that was announced, then you had to subtract off the inflation rate to get the real interest rate. Essentially the same issue arises here. Say that in 2004, GDP increased 4.4%. Nominal GDP did. Now, some of that increase is due to an actual increase in production of goods and services, and some of it is just due to inflation, the price of all goods being higher. As it turns out, in 2004, 2.2% of the overall 4.4% rise in GDP was just due to prices being higher. It was just due to inflation. And the other 2.2% was the real increase in goods and services being produced. When you're looking back over periods of time, it's always important to look at real GDP, adjusted for inflation. For example, if you look at the 1970s, when inflation is high in the United States, it looks like GDP is growing really, really fast. But if you adjust for inflation, then the record of growth doesn't look so amazing in that decade anymore. In the inflation lecture, a couple lectures down the road, we'll discuss how to adjust and how to measure real GDP in more detail. Now, GDP has its share of conceptual imperfections. In fact, one of the things I'll emphasize over and over in the next few lectures is that all economic statistics have a lot of conceptual imperfections. GDP is a measure of what is bought and sold. Thus, things that affect the quality of life but aren't bought or sold won't be directly included in GDP. Classic example, it's what economists call home production. Around the late 1960s and the early 1970s, there's an enormous surge of women into the paid workforce. As a result, many goods and services that had been produced at home before, and I'm thinking here of meals, house cleaning, childcare, were now more likely to be bought and sold in the market. When those things were produced at home, they weren't being bought and sold, so they weren't counted in GDP. When they're produced in the market, then they were counted. But clearly that's a change which is not a real change in what happened in the economy. There are a lot of other things that affect people's standard of living, affect their happiness, but aren't something that's measured directly as something that's bought and sold. For example, leisure. Your time off is not valued by the market in any direct way. If everyone could have 10 hours a week off, or an extra 2 weeks of vacation every year, but output remained the same, GDP would not show any overall gain. The environment is not directly included in GDP because it's not bought and sold. Greater or lesser pollution doesn't show up in GDP measures. Stuff like traffic congestion or the time it takes to commute doesn't show up as something that's bought and sold, except in an indirect way like gasoline, the amount of gasoline that was needed. Certain bad things like, say, crime or natural disaster can lead to more economic activity. If there's a disaster and then you have to rebuild a large part of a city, that might make GDP look great, but it's a lower standard of living to have suffered through a disaster like that. Health is not directly included in GDP. The fact that people have longer life expectancies and are living healthier longer doesn't show up in any direct way. Only the healthcare services show up. Even within GDP, you might ask, if you were in a skeptical frame of mind, if everything bought and sold really deserves the same value, even if some things might seem to have different values in your mind. I mean, for example, is a bag of potato chips the same value as an organic fresh apple? Does Newsweek have the same value as a pornographic magazine? Is a ticket for admission to a violent movie exactly the same value as a ticket for admission to an art museum? Well, GDP is just about adding everything up. It's not about value judgments. Now, I don't want to minimize these issues about the linkage between GDP and standard of living. They matter, and in some cases they can matter a lot. I certainly don't recommend that we pursue GDP at all cost. I don't think everyone should work 60-hour weeks just so GDP could be higher, or that we should pollute the environment just so GDP should be higher, and I don't know any economist who would believe that. But it just shows you that GDP is something of a limited measure. When I was giving you the definition of GDP, I mentioned that it was the final product. The final product. What exactly does that word final mean? Well, GDP includes all the production of intermediate products. One question you can ask about GDP is, this list that I gave you, durable goods, non-durable goods, services, structures, doesn't that leave out a lot of stuff? I mean, what about the inputs, like what about the steel that goes into the cars, or the lumber that goes into the furniture, or the oil that goes into the gasoline? Where did that fit in somehow? Well, all production includes a combination of inputs that are turned into outputs. Making a car includes steel and petrochemicals and computer chips, all sorts of different materials. But all of these inputs are included in the final value of the car when it's sold. If I was going to add up the iron ore industry and the steel industry and the car industry, I would in effect be counting the iron multiple times. When it was first produced, then when it was in the steel, then when it was in the car. So I would be double counting or triple counting, depending on how many stages of production it went through. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis does create some very detailed tables that show all the inputs coming in and their value and the outputs coming out. But for calculating overall what an economy produces, you only need to add up the final product, because the value of the final product includes the earlier things that were produced. It's also true that transfers of ownership do not show up in GDP, not unless they involve new production. For example, say you sell a house and I buy it. Ownership has changed of the house, but nothing new was produced. So there's no addition to GDP. Only new construction of houses or physically fixing up the old ones adds to GDP. Or say that you sell some shares of stock in a company and I buy some shares of stock in a company. Well, ownership of the stock changed, but nothing new is produced. So the stockbroker's fee is included in GDP, but not the value of the stock that was bought and sold. So when the stock market rises or falls substantially, it literally has no direct effect on GDP at all. I mean, people are placing different values on shares of stock, but they're just buying and selling, and for every buyer, there's also a seller. So with all these limits, with all these concerns, with all these worries, at the same time, I don't want to lose what's worthwhile and measurable in GDP. Societies with higher per capita GDP tend to be better off in lots of dimensions. They have more personal consumption, and we shouldn't be snooty about personal consumption. That includes healthcare and education and all sorts of things that most of us value. It includes also that societies with high per capita GDP tend to have cleaner air and water. They tend to have a greater degree of personal security. A wise Nobel laureate from MIT named Robert Solow once said, "If you have to be obsessed by something, maximizing real national income is not a bad choice." Well, maybe it's best not to be obsessed by any one statistic, but GDP really does matter. Makes a big difference over time, and it's unwise to take these kinds of criticisms and run with them and pretend GDP just doesn't matter. The historical pattern of GDP shows a long-term upward trend over time, with occasional short-term dips for recessions. Imagine that you look back at the pattern of GDP over time, going back a half century or so, and let's specify that we're looking at real GDP. That is, it's GDP adjusted for inflation, so you're seeing the actual patterns of economic production. What does it look like? Well, from a long-term perspective, GDP increases substantially over time. After adjusting for inflation, GDP in the mid-2000s was 5.5 times as large as it was in 1950. So you can see it sloping up over time. If you take a long-term perspective, that average growth rate of real GDP from 1950 through 2004 was about 3.2% per year. However, this pattern of growth in GDP is not a straight line, just 3.2% gained every single year. Instead, when you look at the pattern of GDP over time, you see fluctuations around this long-term trend. Sometimes the economy is below the average trend, sometimes it's a little above. In the 20th century, for example, the biggest dip in GDP was the Great Depression, especially the period from 1931 to 1933, when the economy contracted by about a third. Those dips are called recessions, and a recession is technically defined as a significant and lasting downturn in GDP. You sometimes hear people say a recession needs to be a downturn in GDP that lasts 6 months or more, or 2 quarters, but there's nothing official about that. The upward movements between recessions are sometimes called recoveries or upswings. From a long-term perspective, the upward trend in standard of living is the most obvious thing that happens with GDP. But if you're living in the middle of a recession, it's pretty obvious that that's happening too. So there's a difference there between the long run and the short run perspective. The starting and ending points of recessions are not defined by any U.S. government agency, but instead they're defined by a committee of academic economists at a nonprofit research institution called the National Bureau of Economic Research. NBER, as economists call it, is affiliated with lots of researchers who hold faculty positions at colleges and universities. It helps to some extent to fund their research, and it organizes conferences so they can meet with others working in their area and share ideas and criticize each other. The U.S. economy, according to the NBER data, had 22 recessions from 1900 up through the recession of 2001. So it had a recession on average about every 5 years. However, more recently, recessions have been somewhat more rare. There's one in the early 1980s, one in 1990-91, and one in 2001. So it seems like they've been more like 10 years apart recently. It also seems like the recent recessions have gotten somewhat shorter. From the start of the recession to the end, what economists call the peak to the trough, in 2001's recession was 8 months. It was also 8 months during the recession from 1990 into 1991. But the average length of the decline in the economy, if you look at the recession since World War II, was more like 10 months. And if you look at the interwar years, that is that time from World War I to World War II, which of course includes the Great Depression, the length of recessions then was 18 months. So it sort of seems as if the recessions are getting somewhat shorter over time, although that's not a certain conclusion. So with this idea of GDP firmly in mind, I want to give you some guidance as to how the discussion of macroeconomics is going to proceed from here. Macroeconomic policy can be summarized with 4 goals, a framework, and then 2 main sets of tools for accomplishing those goals. And as you look ahead through these lectures on macroeconomics, it's probably useful to have the structure of the discussion, the roadmap in mind. So let's first talk about the 4 goals of macroeconomic analysis. First goal is economic growth. In the long term, is the economy increasing per capita GDP? The next goal is low unemployment. How can the economy keep unemployment low on average, year in and year out? And during recessions, how can it keep unemployment from rising too high or for too long? Third goal, low inflation. How can government act in such a way as to keep inflation under control? And fourth goal, a sustainable balance of trade. Now, that word sustainable you may recognize as a bit of a fudge word, but what exactly does the balance of trade mean, and why does it matter that the U.S. is running enormous trade deficits in the mid-2000s? Now, with those 4 goals, and those will be the next 4 lectures, those 4 goals, we'll then introduce a framework for macroeconomic analysis. This framework is usually called the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. What that framework will do is it will help to organize the macroeconomic analysis in some of the same ways that basic supply and demand help to organize microeconomic analysis. But aggregate supply and aggregate demand are not just microeconomics. What they'll help us think about is what are the trade-offs between growth and unemployment and inflation and the balance of trade. So, with our 4 goals in mind, and our framework for thinking about how these are going to trade off against each other, we'll then be able to move to the 2 main tools of economic policy. And there are 2 main sets of tools for macroeconomic policy. They're broadly called fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is defined as government tax and spending policy, so the federal budget, budget deficits, and taxes and spending. Fiscal policy is, of course, decided by Congress, but needs to be signed by the president as well. So that'll give us a chance to discuss the issue of budget deficits and what happens when spending is larger than taxes. The other big area is monetary policy. Monetary policy refers to the policies of the Federal Reserve. We'll need to talk about what that is, of course, that affect interest rates and credit and how much money is being loaned and borrowed in the economy. The The Federal Reserve decisions in monetary policy are decided by a central bank of political appointees. And so that will raise questions about when should they raise or when should they lower interest rates. And finally, we'll then, with all of this in mind, expand the scope of the discussion to international issues and consider global trade, why trade can benefit economies, what the arguments are for restricting trade, issues of exchange rates, international movements of financial capital, and the evolving shape of the world economy.